We talked about sports and education. We'd have to think about, once we know those variables, how are we actually going to measure them in some way, right? And that's the key problem with survey research, is that we have to think of a precise way to ask a question such that we can get an answer that allows us to measure that variable. So the example I put up on here is social class. This is one that we think we have a good idea kind of in everyday life talking about. I know somebody's high class, low class, right? Sometimes we talk about people in those terms. We probably think we know roughly where we could place ourselves on the class spectrum. But how do we actually know that stuff? Where do we get that stuff from? Class actually is a pretty complicated social variable. It includes a lot of different things. Probably the one we think of the most quickly is income. So how much money someone has could put them from the lower end to the higher end of the spectrum. But is it just about money? We get other indicators of class too. I saw you shook your head no, so can you think of anything else that would be an indicator?
Education level.
Education is an important one, right? Yeah. Occupation, consumption. What kinds of clothes or cars, stuff like that do you wear? We see a lot of examples of this at Colgate, right? Class and the way it's expressed through status and consumption is very apparent in a lot of ways at a place like Colgate. So all those things are markers to us of class. And if we were doing a project like this and we said, I'm looking at the relationship between social class and status and social status, like how popular people are or something like that. We'd have to figure out, what do we mean by class? How are we going to measure it? What kind of variables are the ones that are most important for that? So that's the process of operationalization, is thinking about how do we actually measure it. Do we want to ask for people's income and their level of education? And would we say that those two together make social class? That's a decision we have to make. That's where we look at articles of other people who've done research on this. It helps us because we see how they did it. We don't necessarily have to make it up for ourselves. So just another reason to look at the literature, get help at the library for finding out some stuff about this. Okay? Usually on surveys we want to include some demographic variables in addition to the typical attitudinal variables that are often measured in surveys. How do you feel about leopards in the case of Danny? How do you feel about traditional medicine in Ghana, according to Kenley's project, right? Why do you actually dive for these lobsters even though you know you could get your health injured in the case of Kelsey's project? Those are all kind of attitudes. We want to match them typically with some demographic variables about people's class, people's education, people's family situation, whatever. That kind of help us to kind of mix and match those variables again that will help us in our analysis. We can look for those patterns. Okay? So sampling is really important for survey research because again, we're usually doing larger numbers. We're more concerned about representativeness because we want to do statistical analysis. We're doing a randomized sample, probably in most cases. So sampling is actually really important. We want to make sure we get that right and we get a sample that we can feel pretty good is representative of the population. Response rate is a big part of that. How many people of the ones we give the survey to actually hand it back? So sometimes if you go to your Coop box, you see a survey in there. Has anybody ever had that? Go to the Coop and open up your box and somebody's put a survey in there that they want you to answer for a class project or something like that. They did not do that anymore. Now they're emails a lot, right? So you get emails all the time with survey requests as well, right? How often do you get one of those? Once a month, maybe more often. How many people actually respond to every one of those? Brian does. Nobody else. Thank you, Brian. A social scientist thanks you. We need more people like you because a lot of people don't respond to surveys, right? They just delete, or if it's on the phone, you hang up. If it's in the mail, you throw it in the recycling bin, right? So that means that if a lot of people are not responding, what happens? We say we want to have 100 in our sample, but what if only 20 actually respond? That's a 20% response rate. It's not really that great. It really makes us question whether or not our sample is going to be representative or not. So typically these days, in the past you could get a higher rate because people were more like Brian in the past. But now they're not much like Brian anymore. And it's harder to get a response rate that's much above 50%. So that's what we would shoot for. That would be our standard. And we'd like to get is about 50% if we could. Even that's not great, but sometimes we've got to take what we can get. We want to be super careful about the way we construct our questions too. Because again, with a survey, you don't get a chance to kind of follow up or to rephrase the question. What they see on the paper is what they get, right? So you have to make sure you ask it in a way that doesn't have a bias, that's not going to be confusing or off-putting to the subject. And there's a lot of different ways of asking questions that can be problematic. You can have a leading question, you can have a double-barrel question. Another one, that's one that asks two questions at the same time. Do you like push-ups and do you want to do some more? That would be a double-barrel question, right? It'd be asking two things in the same sentence, basically, right? Using jargon, what would you describe as your social class? Does everybody know what that means? You know, stuff like that. Those would be situations where you want to put that in more kind of layperson's language so that they can be accessible to the people you're studying. And you always want to take your questions and test them before you actually implement them. So if you're going out, you're going to do a project, and you want to hand out surveys to people, don't just go and do that on the first try. Give them to your friends or give them to advisors that you have to give you some feedback about the questions and whether they could be reworded in some way. Okay? Finally, the actual format of the survey is important too. We can do it, like you said, now a lot of them are done by email or the web. We can do them by paper. We can do them on the phone. In any of those ways, you want to be careful about the format. We need to have clear instructions. We usually want to have an introduction or a preamble of some sort that explains the survey to the people and gives them instructions about how to do it. So if you want them to circle something, you should tell them to circle something. If you want them to skip question 4 if they answer question 3 some way, you want to tell them exactly how to do that. Maybe you have an arrow that shows them go here if no, go here if yes. You've all seen surveys like that before, right? So make sure the layout helps you, helps the subjects to answer the questions in the best possible way. Okay? SurveyMonkey, Google Drive, if you're going to do an electronic survey. I would guess that probably most AMS projects are not going to do an email survey of some sort because a lot of people are going to kind of developing context, but you never know. If you're doing one in China, it might work because a lot of people have more access to computers there or other places as well that are a little bit more developed. Okay? Interviews. Operationalization is important for interviews too. We also want to think about our variables and how to measure them through the questions because just like with a survey, we're asking questions. That's the main thing we're doing. We have questions, we give them to people, we want to get a response from them. So we've got to be careful about bias, we've got to be careful about leading questions, things like that in the same way. Although we do have a little bit more flexibility overall. We can follow up. We can see if there's a puzzled look on somebody's face and say, I'll respond to that. Okay? So typically when we're doing an interview project, and especially for your AMS projects, I would guess, in most cases you're going to be using non-randomized samples. You'll be using that purposive sample or that snowball sample. And the way that Brian described it, I think was very good actually. That's more or less how you would actually do it in a lot of cases. And certainly for the ones that Kelsey, Kenley, Danny were doing, they were all doing more of a purposive type of approach, finding out the people, or using a snowball approach. They weren't doing randomized samples for those. So I would guess that those are going to be the terms that you're going to probably use for your proposals too. Interviews can be everything from a really structured interview, which is basically a survey, to a totally unstructured, where you just sit down and say, let's talk. You turn on the recorder, you're like, let's talk. That would be totally unstructured, right? Usually you're not at either one of those ends of the spectrum. Usually you're somewhere in the middle, and that's what we said before is a semi-structured approach, right? Where you have some questions that you want to ask, but at the same time you're allowing for the flexibility of going in different directions depending on what comes up. Okay, so if they say something that surprises you and you didn't anticipate, you sometimes want to follow up on that. Interviews, a semi-structured approach allows you to do that, but at the same time you do have some questions that you want to answer. So that's typically kind of how a lot of these projects go. So you have some set of questions, but you're going to be open to going in different directions depending on what people actually say. How do you actually do the interview? Here's some tips. Again, I've done 11 interviews, so these are some of what I think are kind of my top tips, I guess, for doing a good interview. I usually like to come in with about 10 questions, and A lot of times those would have maybe a couple sub-parts that would be follow-ups for that. And I'm going to be, again, like ready to kind of go in a different direction if I need to. I'm going to start off with easy questions to warm people up, like tell me about your background, tell me about where you're from, where did you grow up, what's your education, stuff like that. And that will warm people up. And it'll be easier to talk about maybe a little bit more personal topics or controversial topics after they're warmed up that way. I want to use silence to my advantage. This is something that is kind of a trick of a teacher, right? If you want to have a class discussion and you ask a question, and you ask the question and nobody says anything, you don't want to jump in right away. You just want to use the silence to your advantage, and it doesn't actually take that much. So our instinct is always to kind of fill in silences, especially when we're on the spot. You ask a question of someone, and you want them to respond, and if they don't, you're like nervous, like, well, maybe it was a bad question. Sometimes people just need time to think, though. So use a little bit of silence, even just a little bit, like 10 seconds. That's a little awkward, right? I've been just like blab, blab, blab the whole time. All of a sudden it's quiet like that. It feels a little weird. The other person is going to want to fill in that space. So that's what you want to use to your advantage in an interview. Don't jump in right away. Let them think about it. Always ask follow-ups, especially when people are vague, they aren't responding the way you wanted them to. Ask a follow-up. Rephrase the question. Or if they say something interesting, follow up on that. Ask them to tell you more about it. In particular, ask for examples, because examples and stories are really the richest part of social science data when you're using a qualitative approach. We want to know about people's lives and experiences. That's why we're talking to them. So if they give you those examples that are specific and detailed, that's going to be the real meaty data that's going to be useful for you in terms of finding answers to your questions. You also want to record. So you should have a digital recorder with you.